Welcome back to Performance Process. My name is Ronan Mc Laughlin and I will be your host today as always. Have you ever noticed as endurance cyclists, we so often spend all winter looking forward to the racing season only to quickly switch and spend much of the racing season thinking about next winter? It makes sense. Time and time again we hear winter miles make summer smiles. When the going gets tough or we miss a goal event, we naturally start to look back at last winter and see opportunities to be much better prepared for next year. But a bigger, better winter and summer smiles don't just happen. We need a plan. Annual training plans are nothing new, but the idea of rigid time, fixed boxes on a calendar never really sat all that well with me. That's why a webinar by today's guest caught my attention. Today I'm joined by Tim Cusick. Tim is a world-class coach and one of the leading voices in endurance data. He's worked with world champions and Olympians. He's led the development of WKO5, and he's the founder of BaseCamp, a training community that blends coaching, strength, nutrition, and mindset into one approach. More importantly for today, Tim has spent years teaching coaches and athletes how to think about training as a process, not just a plan. He sounds perfect for this podcast. And in this conversation, we're going to dig into annual training plans, what's changed and what hasn't, and the way annual training plans are built, and how athletes and coaches can make smarter decisions about when to move on to the next step, when to hold steady, and how to use data without being ruled by it. Tim, welcome to the show.
Thanks, and thanks for having me. I really appreciate being on.
Yeah, it's great to have you on the show. I've been watching webinars of yours and listening to you on podcasts for years and years. So great to have you join the show. And that's actually one of your webinars that I recently stumbled upon and rewatched. Sort of prompted this whole show. Before we maybe get into that, I know you from your Training Peaks and WKO days. Do you want to maybe just, I mentioned BaseCamp there in the intro, give the listeners who maybe do know you and those who maybe don't, just a bit of your background and what you're up to today, or what you're up to these days.
Yeah, sure. It's a little of everything. So I've been coach for over 20 plus years. I've had the luxury, as you stated, of working with world champions, national champions, Olympians. So from a coaching experience, I've had a lot of application and hands-on coaching experience. On the other side, I am the Training Peaks WKO product leader. I've developed WKO 4 and 5 with the team. So I also have, I guess, an extra focus and a love of data and analytics, both in kind of, the nerd side and the actual practical application of data and how that should impact our coaching, our decision-making, and our process. So I have a little bit of both. These days, I pulled back from coaching a little, still working with some great athletes, still doing some big things, but on the same side, less, focusing more on grandkids and family and stuff like that. Our BaseCamp endurance coaching programs, we really are focused on embracing some new technologies, which has been exciting for me. How do we work with online training and all of this new communicative technology, kind of partnered with data and stuff like that? And really, it's been our focus to leverage the technology to bring full coaching and training solutions to people. So I'm still playing in my type of playground where it's like a whole bunch of data. How do we make it work? How can we bring, I guess, a better set of services to the everyday athlete through the utilization of these technologies? And so I'm kind of happy still coaching and still doing some tech development and still working in the data fields.
The tech development, but there's caught my attention. Could I read into that as a WKO 6, or is that putting 2 and 2 together and getting 5?
That's 2 and 2 together and getting 5 at the moment. There's a lot of evolution. Training Peaks is working on continuing to develop its data utilization strategies, and I look for exciting things out of them in the future. And that's probably the best answer I can give you.
Well, I reached out to you to get you on the pod. Well, I reached out to Training Peaks and they put me in touch with yourself about getting you on the pod here, having watched a webinar of yours from, it was early COVID days, I think like 2020, 2021 time or something, around your annual training concepts. And it was like a 3-part webinar. Each of them was about 90 minutes long. It's up there on YouTube, and listeners can find those and dig into them. We'll not rehash those and try and squeeze them into a 1-hour podcast here today. But my initial thought of around having you onto the podcast was just to sort of put it to you and find out from yourself, have those concepts stood the test of time with every time you go on Instagram now, someone will be telling you about zone 2 training or why you should be doing polarized. And it seems like those modalities of training it's suggested they just apply year round. And then you're sort of wondering, well, I wonder if a plan is still required. And then you also see these multidisciplinary athletes who just seem to race all year. And I'm wondering, how do you fit a training plan around that? We will get into that, but maybe before we do, will we just start by laying the ground at work and maybe just ask you, what is an annual training plan?
Yeah, it's a great place to start, right? It's a term we use a lot, but we don't necessarily define, and that definition is important because it does then define how we use the tool. So if we think about an annual training plan, it's really just a strategic framework that maps out your progression, your training, your load, your intensity, application, really, across a season or a year. And if you think about it, it's a great way to communicate the big picture to your athlete of maybe your sequence of training, like when do phases come, what are you working on when. This can be sometimes framed in a classic periodization language and say like, wow, we have a base period, a build period, a peak period, a race period. There's lots of ways to frame that. But I think overall, it is that strategic framework and the ability to conceptualize it as just that really is what makes an annual training plan an important thing to build and to have, but you also have to be skilled at applying it.
And that's really what we're going to get into here as well, is just like not being beholden to the plan, but still the importance of a plan. And as you put it in your webinar, knowing when to move on and knowing when to hold back, and we'll get into all of that. But I take it from what you're saying then, like developing an annual training plan is a crucial part of any process that you're doing with an athlete.
Absolutely. Except I think about it differently, and maybe by changing mindset here a little bit right from the get-go, people will better follow along with this. I don't see it as an annual training plan. I see it as an annual training strategy. When we start to think about an annual plan or the construct we tend to call periodization, we think periodization or the plan is the training itself, and it's not. Periodization is only a system of organization. It's a neutral construct. It's basically taking the idea that you have a long season, an athlete has a goal they want to achieve, they want to be this fast, this strong at some certain date. And it breaks things down into digestible chunks that help you mentally process the development of their longer term training strategy. But when we treat that as a plan, there's a rigidity that creeps into that because you spend a fair amount of time, a lot of detail. As soon as it's a plan, it's like you're planning every week, you're planning every day. And then you get overly linked to that detail and you become overly rigid in the application. And that often is what breaks down that neutral construct. So when you think about annual training planning or annual training strategy development, you're developing a process, a construct of shaping your thinking and guiding the strategy, but not an absolute step-by-step process that then you implement with a vengeance, because that's the trap.
Yeah, there's every time you speak, I'm like, oh, we're going to get to that. And I'm conscious of
Sorry.
Always. No. That's it's just there's so much to say every time you respond. So maybe before we do get to all that, and I promise listeners we will. Do you want to maybe outline, Tim? If you think back to that webinar that you did 3 years ago, or 4 years ago, 5 years ago, whenever it was, what were your overarching concepts that you were outlining in that webinar?
So overall, when we think about the concept of developing an annual training strategy, we have like a set series that we go through, a set process that we want to build into the process. So we always want to start out with purpose. So when you think about this concept of developing an annual strategy, you want to think about purpose. Why are you doing this? This originates at the athlete's goals and desires. And goals aren't always just stand on the podium at this event. There needs to be a relationship to that outcome goal with a bunch of process goals. That really begins to define the purpose of the plan. So you need purpose. And I have a feeling we'll talk about that more deeply. Once you have purpose, you have to understand that training is simply the application of intensity and duration. And you could put frequency in there with duration and then run through a filter of modality. Like, all right, I want a certain amount of duration, a certain amount of intensity in my training along some progressing schedule. But I also need to develop a modality. Am I a polarized trainer? Am I a pyramidal trainer? Am I undulation in my system? Am I mixed? There's lots of ways, but you need to think about that as you go through that annual strategy, because you're going to apply that duration, frequency and intensity loads all in a kind of a set pattern. You then have to look at how those two interact with the athlete and make a constant understanding of the ongoing athlete status. What is their kind of fitness, freshness relationship? Are they fresh enough to do the work that you want, but still doing enough work to be gaining fitness? So you're constantly managing that freshness, fitness relationship in the athlete. And if you could follow a good progressive strategy of doing all that, implementing that in a format that progresses the season, brings the athlete through a series of training cycles and events to get them to that peak performance when they want to be, you're in a pretty good place. So that webinar kind of lays out those steps and how each kind of falls into the annual plan.
Mm-hmm. A key part of it that really resonated with me was this idea that annual training plans don't have to fit into neat little time framed boxes that, like, we've so long heard that they should. And I think it's easy to see an annual training plan as time fixed colored blocks on a calendar. But what you were sort of pointing out in that webinar is that it doesn't have to be that way, and probably actually shouldn't be that way.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest challenges. So a great topic to bring up. I think what happens, right? You write a periodized plan. So, and then this is your annual training plan. Somewhere along the line, as we've learned about physiology, we have learned that periodization is a process of applying training over time. It has a progressive format that tends to resonate with physiology, even though some of the science, it's never truly been hard proven it's absolutely the best. Anecdotally, I think it is, because it helps you organize your training. But from a physiological sense, we're not 100% sure. We look at that periodization plan. We have like nice little 4-week blocks, which we call a cycle. And then those cycles add up to be a macro cycle. What happens when we develop that very rigid sense of periodization or annual training plan, that plan itself becomes a rigid box checking calendar. Like, you have all your little weeks, and then because it's the way our brain processes things, right? We have our little calendar. It looks so great, neat and organized. And it's like, I need to check off week 1, just like it is. And then week 2, that's where we get in trouble. We need to understand it's not a rigid calendar and a box checking exercise. Can I just plan these trainings out and hope the athlete can get to them? It is more of a living strategy. It ebbs and flows, because what's really driving the timing, the periodization, how you treat a microcycle, a macrocycle, a phase, is about how the athlete adapts to the stimuli you're applying. It's, one of the things I'll say to our own coaches, it's not about you, right? It's about your athlete. And you have to understand that the response to exercise stimuli is a very complex event. And not everybody's going to adapt on the same schedule. Not everybody's going to adapt in the same way. So you need a data-based set of qualitative and quantitative, of objective and subjective data points to understand the progression the athlete's making by the desired outcome of that phase, and adjust that rigid time schedule thinking that, hey, I'm just checking off 1 week at a time and feeling like I'm accomplishing something, which you might be, but really then using those data points to know the evolution of the athlete. And it's like kind of the statement I made in that webinar was, don't leave till you have to, but know when it's time to go. And to me, when you look at real mastery of annual planning, it really comes down to that. There tends to be a commonality, like all good coaches have we understand training modalities well. And a modality is just a training rhythm, right? The application of hard, moderate, and easy days in some progressive order that makes magic happen. I think there's a lot of great knowledge about that out there, and you see a lot of coaches implementing that well. But where we get gray is what data points are we connecting to the response to that application of modality? What data points are we understanding how the athlete's adapting to that, so to speak? And then when is that adaptation at a point of diminishing returns, might be the best way to say it. And it's time to move on, to have change occur and progress forward with the athlete.
I think it is like, as athletes, and I think maybe it's just the way the modern world works as well, that we really enjoy and we really value something that has like a detailed, the time fixed element of training plans the way they've always been. It's like, I will do 6 weeks of or 4 weeks of build, and then I will move on to peak, and 2 weeks of that, and then I will move on to my race, and formulate it out that way. And as long as we're sticking to that, we feel like we're achieving something. But the risk you're saying is that by adhering to those rigid blocks on a calendar, you maybe target an outcome from a training block for longer than you need to, and so you end up missing out on gains that you could make in the next block, or you don't spend long enough at it. But either way, it's a case of don't move until it's time to go, is kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, you just summed it up very well. Go back to this idea that your annual training plan, your periodized plan, is a neutral construct. And then when you apply a rhythm expectation, a training modality expectation, an application of, intensity, duration, and frequency, we put it in that nice little box. That's still, that's why I call it a strategy, not a plan. That's still neutral because you're applying that process for a reason. You expect something to occur. That something is a physiological event. It's a performance event. You might be looking for the development of aerobic capacity. You might be looking for the development of, 1 hour power. There's lots of ways, 10, 20-minute power, whatever you might be looking at. So when you consider breaking out those nice little neutral concept blocks, have outcome goals, have a process goal of how you're going to get there, but have an outcome goal. Like, one of the great ways to know when it is time to move on is to have put in the process, to have built into the process some potential key indicators of its time. Like, it's time to move on, meaning, so if you hit that power goal, if you achieve that physiological goal through testing or modeling or whatever you're using, then you should say, okay, maybe I should move on now, which was a little earlier than I originally planned, or maybe even a little later than you originally planned. But you're balancing the neutral construct. It's helping you think, it's putting things in neat little order. But then you're using the acquisition of different data types to make better decision to maximize that progression instead of staying limited within the check mark plan, right? The calendar becomes the checkbox. I just want to check off all my to-do lists, and each week becomes a to-do list. By using data in that sense to make better decisions, you're following the strategy, still getting the benefit of what you've outlined as a progressive series of training events and phases, but you're better ebbing and flowing, adapting to the athlete's actual adaptation.
So I have a habit of coming up with terrible analogies, and the one I have for this, and it's maybe worth me saying, first of all, like, as much as I don't know if buy into our philosophies here, I think match up very, very well. I believe a lot in what you're saying, but I still have difficulty not falling into the age-old way of thinking. And one of the ways I've tried to bring my head around to this type of thinking is, if you think of if you were building a house, and we talk about the foundations being your base and all that, but if you just think about the gable wall, there will be a set height on the plans that we want that gable wall to be. And if the builder, maybe, and the architect has come up with the idea that it's going to take the builder a week to do this wall, if he gets to that height within 4 days, you don't want them to keep on building because it's time to move on to the roof. And that's the best I can come up with. But maybe there's an example from an actual training strategy from, the base period or something, where what type of metrics are you looking at and what type of response are you looking for to know when it is time to actually move on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, when I build this annual training strategy, I like to break those phases down and I don't call, and if you watch the webinar, you'll see my terminology in there, but not to get into that. But following the classic idea of base, build, into peak, into race, if you were to look at that, I tend to put in place for my athletes, and honestly, the higher level the athlete is competing, the more diligent I am in this, meaning it actually takes more parameters for the professional athlete than maybe the everyday racer like myself. I want to have a set of process goals for that phase. Like I want to have accomplished this, and this in my training. And we tend to think when, I have an expertise in data, or I believe I have an expertise in data. There's a lot smarter people than me, but I've been experiencing it for a long time, that it's like super robust data, this fancy chart element cross anaerobic capacity with neuromuscular. It's not. I really start with process goals and think about it this way. Can your athlete do this? And in those process goals, it could be as simple as, can they execute a 4-hour ride? Can they, and hold some general baseline of power? Can they build training consistency? Can they get in the habit of training 5 to 6 days a week? Because that is a significant positive impact to adaptation. So don't just think when we start, it's like some fancy data. Process goals can be just behaviors of the athlete. Then I have outcome goals, but I break outcome goals into each phase. And this is the trap. It sounds so rigid. Can you ride your trainer for 4 hours? If they make 355, we'll give them a slide. If they go 5, great too, so don't take it as too rigid. But then my outcome goals, I'll have what I call a performance goal. And that often is I'm a power-based trainer. It is absolutely the most efficient way to train, or I shouldn't say efficient, effective way to train. I want them to be able to do, 20 minutes of power of X, an hour of power of Y, 4 hours of power of X. It depends, what they're training for and what they're doing. So I'll have some specific general applications of saying, I'm looking in this phase of accomplishing an improved foundation, as you said. And maybe that's based on a combination of anaerobic capacity, muscular endurance, neuromuscular performance, a couple of other elements. So I'll say, okay, we have some measurements of those, but I want the output measurement first. Can you hit 300 watts for 20 minutes or 150 watts for 20 minutes? Can you improve from where you start to X, in some amount of time related to our goals? But then I do also like to look against physiological data. And in the physiological data, and in all data, and you and I have talked about this earlier, there's a good, better, best relationship. I think when we think about data, people are like, it's either perfect data or no data or nothing works, right? There's a lot of data that you can access, through your athlete. Are they getting lab tested once a month? That's great. That's best data. Are they collecting accurate power and heart rate data, and you have access to models and other information about, how they're adapting and things like that? Okay, that's good. That's best. That's the one in the middle. And even just subjective data. If they don't have a power meter and they don't have access to labs, just talking to them about feel and performance, and heck, you could use speed. There's all kinds of different things you can do. But I want some physiological data there. So I'm looking at the performance data. The performance data tells me rate of change and what has changed in their actual output performance. And the physiological data, if we can capture it well through lab or modeling, explains to me why they changed. And that helps me intuitively make the application of knowledge, make the appropriate adjustments to the next step. So it's important that you look at those three combinations: process, what they can do, what they can accomplish, performance data, and physiological data.
Okay, folks, that's where we're cutting off the free version of this podcast this week. Just a reminder, if you head over to escapecollective.com/member, you can sign up now and you can get the entire podcast uninterrupted. You'll not have me butting in to cut you off or to remind you that you're not yet a member. And in doing so, you will be helping to ensure this podcast continues for many more episodes and months and years to come. So head over escapecollective.com/member now to sign up to Escape Collective and to get the entire episode of Performance Process, along with all of the other podcasts and written content that we publish on our website.